The candles in the corridor of Larkspear Hall had burned low by the time Verity Hale realized she had left her shawl behind. The evening's toasts were finished. The guests dispersed to their rooms. And tomorrow she would become Lady Nathaniel Farrow. And the life she had built from necessity and silence would fold itself into something new. She retraced her steps through the dark passage toward the study, her hand trailing the wainscoting, and she would have walked straight to the door if she had not heard his voice. Gideon's voice. Low and unsteady in a way she had never heard from him, as though the glass he held had loosened something he kept carefully sealed the rest of the time. She stopped 3 feet from the open door. The light from inside fell in a narrow bar across the stone floor. She did not move toward it. She did not move away. And then she heard what he said, and the floor became uncertain beneath her feet. "She is the only woman I will ever love, Nathaniel." A pause, the sound of glass set down. "I need you to be good to her. I need you to be genuinely good to her, because I cannot be. I cannot be anything to her at all." Verity stood in the dark hallway and did not breathe. Nathaniel began to answer. She heard the shape of his voice without the words, something careful and quiet, and she understood without hearing the syllables that he was taking his brother's confession seriously, that he was not dismissing it as drink and sentiment. She did not wait to hear what he said. She stepped back, 1 step, 2, and turned toward the staircase with her hand pressed flat against the wall, and the shawl stayed where she had left it, draped over the arm of the chair inside, and she did not go back for it. She did not breathe properly until she reached the door of her room. Inside, the fire had been banked for the night, and the room held the particular stillness of a house that had finally gone quiet after too many people and too much noise. Verity sat on the edge of the bed without lighting a candle. She sat in the dark with her hands folded in her lap, and she stayed there for a long time. She had known Gideon Farrow for 2 years. She had known him as the Duke of Larkspear, which meant she had known him as a title before she knew him as a man. A figure of consequence in the county, whose estate stood 4 miles north of Fenbridge Village, whose name appeared on documents and above the signatures of solicitors. She had known him as Nathaniel's older brother, which meant she had known him as a presence at the edges of her courtship, steady and unreadable, appearing at the shop sometimes on estate business and departing before she found the occasion to say anything of substance to him. She had known him as the man who had steadied her ladder 8 months ago when she was reaching for a volume on the high shelf, and the step had shifted. His hand at her waist, brief and correct, and both of them pretending afterward that nothing had happened, which was the only sensible thing to do. She had not known him as this. She pressed her palms together in her lap and made herself think clearly. She was 28 years old. She had raised her sisters, Elspeth and Clara, since her father's death 2 years ago. She had kept the shop from failing by margins so thin she still sometimes woke at 3 in the morning and counted the week's receipts in her head before she remembered they were already written in the ledger. She had accepted Nathaniel Farrow's courtship because he was kind and uncomplicated, and because his affection for her was genuine, and because her sisters liked him enormously, and because she had decided, at some point in the last year, that what she felt for Gideon was not something she was permitted to act on, and that the practical and decent thing was to marry the man who had actually asked her. She had thought until this evening that the feeling was entirely one-sided. She sat with this new knowledge in the dark and turned it over the way she turned a ledger entry that did not balance. Looking for the error, looking for the column she had miscounted. There was no error. He had said it plainly, and his voice had not been the voice of a man constructing a sentiment for his brother's benefit. It had been the voice of a man saying something he had been holding for a very long time. And he had told her nothing. He had told Nathaniel. He had told a room she was not supposed to be standing outside of at 11 o'clock at night, on the eve of her wedding. He had told the dark and the dying candles and a glass he had already set down, and he had framed it as a reason for Nathaniel to be kind to her, as though his own feeling were simply a fact of the landscape that needed to be managed rather than addressed. Verity sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what it would mean to walk downstairs tomorrow and say that she had heard. She thought about Nathaniel's face. Open and earnest, genuinely fond of her. Not a man who deserved to have his wedding morning turned to wreckage. She thought about Gideon, who had already made his decision and communicated it to his brother and sealed it and moved on, who had not come to her. She thought about her sisters, and the shop, and the school fees that had somehow kept arriving through a solicitor's trust that she had never fully questioned. And she thought about what it would cost two brothers who loved each other if she walked downstairs and said, "I was outside the door." She would say nothing. She lay down on top of the coverlet without undressing, and she looked at the ceiling in the dark. And she made the decision the way she made most of her decisions. Not with feeling, because feeling was a luxury she had learned to defer, but with the clear-eyed arithmetic of a woman who had learned that some debts could not be paid, and some doors, once closed, were better left that way. She would marry Nathaniel. She would be a good wife to him. She would not destroy two brothers she loved in different ways over a confession made to the dark. She lay there until the candle stub on the mantel guttered out entirely. And then she lay there a while longer, and the hall was very quiet. And tomorrow she would be married. Gideon found her at breakfast. She had come down early, before the household's wedding preparations had reached full noise, and she was sitting at the long table in the morning room with a cup of tea she was not drinking and a plate of toast she had not touched. She heard his step in the corridor. She had learned the sound of it without meaning to, the particular even weight of it. And she arranged her face before he appeared in the doorway. He looked, she noticed, as though he had not slept. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper than usual, and there was a careful quality to the way he held himself, the kind of stillness that costs something to maintain. "You're up early," he said. "There were things to see to," Verity replied. He came to the table and poured his own coffee from the pot on the sideboard, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She watched him from the corner of her eye and saw him look at her, not quickly, but with the particular attention he had always given her, the kind that made her feel observed more precisely than she was comfortable with. "You seem quiet this morning," Gideon said. He sat down across the table from her, nodded its head, and his voice carried the careful, measured tone of a man choosing his words with deliberate care. "That's understandable. It's a significant day." "It is," Verity agreed. "Nathaniel is a good man," Gideon said. "You know that already. But I want you to know that the family considers you." He stopped. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking. "You will be well looked after. I will see to it personally." And there it was, the confirmation she had not quite wanted but had half expected. The careful, managed reassurance of a man who had already closed the door on the night before and was now standing on the other side of it, making sure the latch was firm. He was not going to say anything. He had decided, and he was going to be steady and correct about it. And she was going to be grateful and quiet about it. And they were both going to pretend that the word love had never been spoken in the dark. Something in her chest hardened into resolution. Nathaniel arrived then, easy and warm as he always was, still buttoning his cuff as he came through the door. He kissed her cheek and reached past Gideon for the bread and made some observation about the weather and the state of the lane. And the contrast between his uncomplicated affection and the charged, careful silence she and Gideon had just been sitting inside was so complete that Verity found herself looking at Nathaniel with something very close to tenderness. He had not done anything wrong. He had asked her honestly and waited patiently and brought her sister's sweets from the confectioner in Fenwick and carried boxes at the shop without being asked. He deserved a wife who came to him freely, not one who had spent the night before her wedding sitting in the dark, listening to the arithmetic of other people's decisions. She would marry him, not as defeat, as loyalty. "I have an errand at the shop," Verity said, pushing back her chair before the meal was properly finished. "Some accounts that need settling before the week is out." "On the morning of your wedding?" Nathaniel asked, smiling at her. "The accounts don't know what morning it is," she said, and she picked up her gloves from the chair beside her and left the room. And she did not look at Gideon as she went. The shop steadied her. It always had. There was something in the smell of it, ink and old paper and the particular dry warmth of books stored close together, that returned her to herself in a way nothing else managed. She had grown up in these rooms, had learned to read sitting on the floor behind the counter while her father served customers, had learned accounts at this same desk when she was 12 years old, and her father's bookkeeping had grown too disordered for him to track alone. The shop was competence made physical. It was the proof, recorded in ledger columns and organized shelves, and her sister's school fees paid on time, that she had managed. She spent the days before the wedding in the familiar routine of it, and the routine held her together. The accounts for the quarter were in good order. The suppliers had been paid. Elspeth's school fees for the coming term were recorded and set aside, and Clara's drawing lessons had been arranged through the autumn. Verity moved through the tasks with the focused precision that had always been her defense against feeling things she could not afford to feel. Nathaniel visited twice. He was easy company. He sat on the stool behind the counter and talked to her sisters about their lessons, and he carried 2 crates of new stock from the delivery cart without being asked, and he did not notice or remark on the careful distance she was maintaining. She was grateful for his obliviousness, and then immediately guilty for her gratitude, and then she went back to the accounts. Then the storm came. It arrived on the 3rd evening without much warning, a hard summer storm that turned the lane to running water within an hour and sent the drainage channel at the side of the building over its banks. Verity came downstairs at the sound of it to find the lower shelves already damp, the floorboards dark with water creeping under the door. She was calculating which crates to move first when she heard the front step, and then the door opened, and it was not Nathaniel. Gideon was already wet. He had come on horseback rather than by carriage, and his coat was dark with rain, and he did not stop to explain himself. He simply looked at the water on the floor, looked at the shelves, and began moving her sister's school books to the high counter with the efficiency of a man who had already assessed the problem before he walked through the door. "The lower shelves," Verity said, because she needed to say something. "I see them," Gideon replied. They worked without speaking. He moved the heavier crates, and she followed with the smaller volumes, stacking them on the counter and the reading table and the window sills. And the rain came harder against the glass, and the lamps swung in the draught from the door. Elspeth appeared at the top of the stairs, and Gideon told her, without looking up from the crate he was lifting, that she should stay upstairs and keep Clara with her. And Elspeth, who was 14 and not generally inclined to take instruction from anyone, went back upstairs without argument. He worked for the better part of an hour. He moved things Verity would have struggled with alone. He found the bucket under the back stairs without being shown where it was kept. And he set it under the leak in the rear ceiling. And he did all of this without asking whether she wanted his help or explaining why he had known to come. When the worst of it was done, he picked up his coat from the hook where he had hung it and moved toward the door. "Gideon," Verity said. He stopped with his hand on the latch. She had meant to thank him. She had the words assembled, a proper, measured expression of gratitude, the kind she was practiced at giving. But standing there in the lamplight with her wet hem and the smell of rain in the room and the books stacked in improbable towers around them, she found that the words she had prepared were entirely wrong for what she actually wanted to say, and she did not know what the right words were. "Thank you," she said, which was the wrong thing but the only safe thing. He nodded once and left before she found anything better. 8 months before the wedding eve, on a Tuesday in October with the light going early and the shop empty of customers, Gideon Farrow had arrived at Hale's bookshop with a leather satchel of estate volumes and a note from his steward explaining that several of the books required rebinding and that the Duke had recommended Miss Hale's shop for the work. Verity had been on the ladder when he came in. The bell above the door had rung, and she had called that she would be down in a moment. And then the ladder had shifted on the uneven floorboard she kept meaning to fix. And his hand had been at her waist before she registered that he had crossed the room. Brief, correct. Both of them stepping back immediately, the ladder steadied, the moment over. He had stayed afterwards, for longer than the transaction required. He had looked at the shelves with the attention of a man who actually read the books on them. He had asked about a particular edition of agricultural history she had behind the counter, and they had talked about it for 20 minutes. Standing on opposite sides of the room, and when he left he had not looked at her in a way that meant anything, or not anything she could point to. She thought about his hand at her waist for the better part of a week. What Gideon remembered of that Tuesday, sitting at his desk in Larkspear Hall 6 weeks later with his steward Clement Marsh standing across from him, was the particular quality of her attention. The way she listened, not impatiently, not performing interest, but actually taking in what was said and filing it somewhere. The way she had moved through her own shop with the ease of a person who had built something and knew every inch of it. "The Hale account," Gideon said to Marsh. Marsh set the papers on the desk without comment. He was a careful man of 50 who had served the previous Duke and had learned, in the years of the current one's tenure, that the instructions he received were sometimes framed as estate business when they were in fact something else, and that his role was to execute them precisely and ask nothing about the origin. "The debt registered against the shop," Gideon said. "The outstanding amount from her father's borrowing. I want it cleared." Marsh looked at him. "Through a solicitor's trust," Gideon said. "Fielding in Fenwick will do it. The payment originates from the trust, and the trust is funded through the estate's discretionary account. Miss Hale receives notice of settlement from Fielding. My name does not appear anywhere in the transaction." "And if she inquires about the benefactor?" Marsh asked. "Fielding will tell her the trust was established for the relief of local tradespeople in financial difficulty," Gideon said. "It is not a lie. I intend to use it for exactly that purpose." Marsh wrote it down. "The school fees for the younger sisters," Gideon continued. "Both girls, quarterly. Same arrangement, same trust, same instructions." Marsh finished writing and looked up. He said nothing, because nothing was required of him, and because he had served this family long enough to know when a man had made up his mind. Gideon signed the order and set down the pen. He did not think about it as sacrifice, precisely. He thought about it as arithmetic, the kind his father had never bothered to perform, which was why the estate had arrived in Gideon's hands mortgaged to the ceiling and why the Constance Pemberton arrangement had become necessary. The Hale family's difficulty was a problem with a solution. He had the means to apply the solution. The fact that his name could not be attached to the solution without raising questions about his interest in a bookseller's daughter was simply a constraint of the landscape. And constraints of the landscape were managed, not mourned. He told himself this clearly, sitting alone at his desk after Marsh had gone, and he found it entirely convincing. Nathaniel found the ledger on a Thursday morning in the third week before the wedding. He had been working through Gideon's estate accounts at Gideon's own suggestion, learning the shape of the finances before he established his own household, his brother had said. And Nathaniel had thought nothing of it, except that it was like Gideon to be thorough. He had been at the library table for 2 hours, working through quarterly records with the systematic patience he brought to most tasks, when he turned a page and found entries in his brother's own hand. The debt settlement, a sum that represented, Nathaniel calculated, almost everything Verity's father had owed at his death. The school fees, quarterly, 2 names, 2 years of entries, each one initialed by Gideon in the margin. The trust name, the solicitor, the date the arrangement had begun. 3 months before Nathaniel had first called on Verity at the shop. Nathaniel sat with the ledger open for a long time. He was not a man who rushed at things. He thought carefully, and he felt carefully. And when he had finished thinking, he closed the ledger and put it back in its place on the shelf and went to find his hat and coat. He did not go to Gideon. He went to the shop. Verity was behind the counter when he arrived, entering a column of figures in her careful hand. She looked up when he came in and smiled at him, the warm, uncomplicated smile she always gave him. And he stood across the counter from her and looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "I need to ask you something," Nathaniel said, "and I need you to answer me honestly. Not carefully, honestly." Verity set down her pen. "Do you love my brother?" Nathaniel asked. The shop was very quiet. Outside, someone passed on the lane, a cart horse's hooves on the cobbles, fading. Verity did not answer. She looked at him with her hands flat on the counter, and her expression doing the thing it always did when the subject turned to her own heart. Going very still, very controlled. The precise opposite of the openness she showed when she was talking about her sisters or the shop or anything that did not cost her to discuss. Her silence was the clearest answer he had ever received from anyone. Nathaniel nodded. He did not press her. He did not ask her to confirm it in words, because she had already answered him in the only way she was capable of answering something that large. And he understood that. He said quietly, "All right." He picked up his hat from the counter where he had set it and walked to the door. And then he stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "I should tell you," Nathaniel said, "that I think you are one of the finest people I have ever known. And I should tell you that what I am going to do next has nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the fact that I will not build my life on something that was never honestly mine to begin with." He left. Verity stood behind the counter with her hands still flat on the wood, and she did not move for a considerable time. Nathaniel returned to Larkspear Hall and found Gideon in the study. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at his brother, who was at his desk with papers in front of him and the particular expression he wore when he was concentrating on something he would rather not think about. "I've seen the ledger," Nathaniel said. "The entries in your hand, 2 years of them." Gideon looked up. "I'm not angry," Nathaniel said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not here to be angry at you." He came into the room and stood at the edge of the desk. But I will not stand at the altar knowing what I know. I will not build a marriage on your unspoken sacrifice and her grateful silence. That is not what I want my life to be. Gideon said nothing. His hands were very still on the papers in front of him. I think you should consider what you actually want, Nathaniel said, before it becomes impossible to choose it. He left the room. The door closed behind him with a quiet, definitive sound. 3 nights after Nathaniel's visit to the shop, Larkspear Hall was quiet past 10 o'clock, and Verity Hale was in the library. She had come because she knew he would be there. He worked late. She had observed this over 2 years of visits to the hall, and the library lamp was the last one lit in the house most evenings. She had the receipts in her bag, 26 of them, folded and preserved in the order she had received them, covering 2 years of quarterly school fees and the single large settlement notice from Fielding the solicitor that had arrived 6 weeks after her father's death, and had, she had always told herself, come from some anonymous charitable arrangement she did not fully understand. She had known the handwriting for over a year. She had recognized it on the 3rd receipt, the particular formation of the capital letters, the slight forward lean of the figures. Because she had handled enough of his correspondence through the shop's book orders to know how Gideon Farrow wrote his numbers. She had looked at the 3rd receipt for a long time, and then she had filed it with the others and said nothing. Because she had decided it was pity, and she would not be anyone's object of pity. And if she said nothing, then she did not have to feel what she would feel if she confirmed it. She set the receipts on his desk. Gideon looked at them. Then he looked at her. I want to know why you never told me, Verity said. Her voice was even. She had worked to make it even. I want to know why. For 2 years, you let me believe it was a solicitor's trust for local tradespeople in difficulty. And you said nothing. Gideon rose from his chair. He did not move around the desk. He stood and looked at the receipts, and then back at her. And she could see him doing what he always did, finding the controlled, correct version of what he wanted to say. I was trying to give you a life, he said, in which you did not owe anyone anything. You gave me a life, Verity said, built entirely on a debt I could never pay, to the one man I was never permitted to thank. His jaw tightened. Do you understand what that is? She continued. To receive something that large from someone you... She stopped. To receive it in silence, without being allowed to know, without being allowed to choose whether you wanted to accept it. You took my choice away from me. You decided what was good for me, and you arranged it without asking me. And then you arranged my future with your brother without asking me that either. And you called it care. It was care, Gideon said. It was control, Verity said, dressed in kindness. The word landed in the room, and neither of them spoke for a moment. She watched something cross his face, not anger, something more uncomfortable than anger. I had nothing to offer you openly, Gideon said. The estate was mortgaged. My name attached to your family's debt settlement would have meant questions about my interest in a bookseller's daughter. And those questions would have cost you more than the debt. I did what I could do within what the situation allowed. And Nathaniel? Verity asked. Was that also within what the situation allowed? Gideon was quiet. You pointed your own brother at me, she said. You saw to it that the debt was cleared and the fees were paid, and then you sent Nathaniel to court me, and you stood at the edges of every visit and said nothing. And you let me believe I was building something real. Nathaniel's feelings for you are entirely real, Gideon said. I know that, Verity said. That is the worst part of it. She reached out to gather the receipts from the desk, and his hand came down over hers. Not gripping, not stopping her, just resting there, his palm over her fingers, as though he needed to confirm that she was present and solid and actually saying these things to him in the lamplight. Neither of them moved. The fire had burned low. The lamp on the desk was the only steady light in the room, and in it she could see the exhaustion in his face and the particular quality of attention he had always given her, the kind that made her feel seen more completely than she knew how to manage. She picked up the receipts with her other hand. She left the room without looking back. She did not sleep. She lay in the room the hall had given her and listened to the house settle and thought about what she had said and what he had answered, and she was still awake when she heard the sound from down the hall. A small, sharp sound. A child's cough that did not stop. Clara. Verity was out of bed and in the hall before she had finished thinking, and she found her youngest sister feverish and confused, her skin hot to the touch and her breathing quick and shallow. Verity sat on the edge of the bed and took Clara's hand and said calm, steady things. And inside she was running calculations. The physician was in Fenwick, 4 miles in the dark, and Nathaniel was not at the hall tonight. And she did not know which of the footmen to wake, or whether the hall's own physician was in residence, or the sound of hooves on the drive. She went to the window and could not see clearly in the dark, but she heard voices below, the groom and someone else, and then the sound of the front door opening. 15 minutes later, Gideon came upstairs with Dr. Hurst from Fenwick behind him, and he said nothing about how he had known, and she did not ask. Dr. Hurst examined Clara and pronounced it a summer fever, serious but manageable, and gave instructions for the night. He left medicines and departed, and Verity sat in the chair beside the bed, and Gideon sat in the chair on the other side, and neither of them spoke about anything that mattered. At some point in the deepest part of the night, when Clara's breathing had steadied and the worst of the fever seemed to be passing, Verity became aware that Gideon's hand was holding hers across the width of the bed. She did not know exactly when it had happened, whether she had reached for him or he for her. It did not seem to matter. She held on, and he held back, and Clara slept between them. And outside the window, the sky was the deep blue that comes just before dawn. He left before the light was full. She heard him go, the careful step, the quiet door, and she sat alone in the chair with her hands in her lap and watched her sister sleep. Nathaniel heard of the night by morning. He said nothing to Gideon, but he watched them both at dinner that evening with the quiet, unhurried attention of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment. The dowager, Lady Augusta Farrow, arrived at dinner with the air of a woman who had been patient long enough. She was a handsome woman of 60, with opinions she deployed like furniture, placed precisely where they would be most difficult to move around. The Constance announcement, Lady Augusta said to Gideon, across the soup course, in the tone she used for matters she considered already settled. I have spoken to Lady Pemberton, and she is expecting a date by the end of this week. The delay has become noticeable. I am aware, Gideon said. Then you will give her a date, Lady Augusta said. I will, Gideon said. Nathaniel, sitting across the table, looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he looked at Verity. Then he set down his spoon and picked up his wineglass and said nothing at all. And his expression was the expression of a man who had reached the end of a very long deliberation and arrived somewhere solid. The parish chapel at Fenbridge was full. The whole county had come, or so it seemed to Verity as she stood at the back of the nave in her wedding dress with her sisters beside her, and the morning light coming through the east windows in long pale bars across the stone floor. She had slept finally in the small hours of the night, and she had woken with a clarity that felt less like peace than like the absence of alternatives. She had made her decision. She would walk to the altar. She would say the words. She would be a good wife to a good man, and she would not look at the third pew on the left. She walked down the aisle on the arm of her uncle, and the congregation rose, and Nathaniel was at the altar looking at her with his steady, clear-eyed expression, and she thought, "He is a good man, and this is the right thing, and I will not feel what I feel." She reached the altar. The vicar opened his book. The congregation settled. Nathaniel turned to face her fully, and she saw in his expression something she had not expected. Not nerves, not happiness, but a particular quality of resolution that she recognized because she had worn it herself. And it meant a person was about to do something that could not be undone. "Before we proceed," Nathaniel said. The vicar looked up from his book. The congregation stirred. Verity went very still. "I need to say something," Nathaniel said. And he said it to the congregation as much as to her. Quietly, but in the chapel's stone acoustics, clearly enough for every person present to hear. "I cannot in good conscience marry a woman whose heart was never fully mine to ask for. I have known this for a fortnight. I let the preparations continue anyway, because I hoped she would choose it regardless." He paused. "She deserves better than hope as a foundation." He looked at Verity directly. "I am asking you, in front of everyone here, to tell the truth once. Out loud, just once." The chapel held the particular silence of a large room in which everyone has stopped breathing. Verity stood at the altar in her wedding dress and looked at Nathaniel, who had just publicly dismantled his own wedding for her sake. And she thought about all the reasons to say nothing. Her sisters in the second pew, her reputation in the county, the practical catastrophe of this moment. And then she stopped thinking about reasons and simply felt what she felt, which was what she had been refusing to feel for 2 years. She turned and looked at the third pew on the left. Gideon was already on his feet. Lady Constance Pemberton sat beside him, very composed, very still. The dowager, beyond her, had the expression of a woman watching an expensive arrangement come apart and calculating the damage. Gideon looked at none of them. He looked at Verity, and she looked at him, and the whole chapel watched as he stepped out of the pew and walked across the stone floor toward her. He stopped at the foot of the altar steps. He did not look at his brother, or at the vicar, or at the congregation. He looked at her. "Everything I did," Gideon said, "I did to give you a safer life than my own. The debt, the fees, Nathaniel." His voice was steady, but it cost him. "I believed that safety and love were different gifts, and that I could give you one while keeping the other." He stopped. "I was wrong. I understand that now. I was wrong to believe that giving you away was the same as loving you well. And I was wrong to think you had no right to know who was doing it and why." The dowager did not stand. Lady Constance did not speak. 300 people held their breath inside a stone building on a Tuesday morning in June. "I have the estate's debt to consider," Gideon continued, "and Lady Constance's dowry, and the dowager's expectations, and the county's opinion, and I am standing here in front of all of them, and I am telling you that I would rather lose every one of those things than spend the rest of my life at a safe distance from the only woman I have ever." "Gideon," Verity said. He stopped. "I heard you," she said. "The night before last night. The study door. I heard what you told Nathaniel." Something shifted in his face. "I have known the handwriting on the receipts for over a year," she said. "I said nothing because I thought it was pity, and I could not bear to be anyone's object of pity. She looked at him steadily. It was not pity. No, Gideon said. It was not. Then say what it was, Verity said. He held her gaze. The chapel was absolutely silent. It was love, Gideon said. It was always love. Badly managed and poorly expressed and hidden behind a great deal of legal paperwork, but love. Nathaniel, standing to the side of the altar with his hands folded and his expression one of quiet, exhausted relief, made a sound that was almost a laugh. That is the most accurate description of you I have ever heard, Nathaniel said to his brother, and several members of the congregation, unable to help themselves, agreed. The garden behind the chapel was small and walled, with an old stone bench under a pear tree and the sound of the congregation still audible through the thick walls. Voices rising and falling in the particular register of people processing an extraordinary mourning. Verity stood in the middle of the path, with her wedding flowers still in her hands, because she had not thought about what to do with them. And Gideon stood 3 feet away from her and looked at her with the expression of a man who has said the most important thing he has ever said in his life, and is now waiting to learn whether it was enough. The estate, Verity said. The estate will manage, Gideon said. Without the Pemberton dowry? I have a minor property in the north that I have been meaning to sell for 3 years. The proceeds will clear what remains. He paused. It will be a careful few years. I am not unacquainted with careful. Verity looked at him. Can you forgive a man, Gideon asked, who mistook giving you away for loving you well? She crossed the 3 feet between them and kissed him. Not gently. There was nothing gentle about it. It was the first fully honest act either of them had managed in 2 years. And it tasted like relief and anger and the specific tenderness of something that has been held back too long. His hands came up to her face, and she had dropped the flowers somewhere on the path, and neither of them noticed. And the voices through the chapel wall continued to rise and fall. And the pear tree dropped a single leaf onto the bench. And none of it mattered at all. When she finally stepped back, she looked at him with her hands still against his chest and said, You are going to have to be considerably less secretive. I am aware, Gideon said. The receipts, she said. When there are things that concern me, you tell me. Directly. You do not route them through solicitors. Agreed, Gideon said. And you ask me, she said. Before you arrange anything, you ask. Verity, Gideon said, with the expression of a man who has just understood something fundamental. I am asking you now, will you let me try to do this properly? She looked at him for a moment. Outside the garden wall, the village of Fenbridge was going about its Tuesday, entirely unaware that the county's social order had just rearranged itself in a chapel the size of a drawing room. She answered simply, Yes, but you should know that I am going to keep the receipts. I would expect nothing less, Gideon said. The northern property sold in August. The proceeds settled the last of the estate's debt, with enough remaining that Gideon, sitting across from Verity at the shop counter one evening in September, while she reviewed a correspondence from the county school board, made a proposal of a different kind. The board required a reliable supplier for the county's 12 schools. Primers, atlases, arithmetic books, quarterly. The contract was substantial. The shop was the most organized book-selling operation in the district, and Verity had the accounts to prove it. It would require expanding the storage, Verity said, reading the letter a second time. The room above the back stairs, Gideon said. It has been used for nothing useful since your father's time. You have been in that room? I moved several crates of your sister's school books there during the flood, he said. "It is sound and dry and approximately the right size." She looked at him over the top of the letter. He looked back at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of innocence, which was not very convincing, but was genuine. "You are doing it again," she said. "I am making a suggestion," he said. "You are free to decline it." "I am not declining it," she said. "I am noting that you have already assessed the storage situation." "I assess things," Gideon said. "It is a habit. I am working on it." She set the letter down and looked at him, and the lamplight was warm on the shelves of books around them, and the shop smelled of ink and paper and the tea she had made an hour ago. And she thought about the woman who had sat in the dark on the edge of a bed on a wedding eve and made a decision to say nothing, and how completely that woman had been wrong about what silence could protect. They were married in October, quietly, with Nathaniel as witness and her sisters in new dresses and the dowager in attendance, who had, after a period of pointed displeasure, concluded that a duke's wife who ran a successful commercial enterprise under county contract was marginally preferable to the alternative, which was her son being publicly and permanently unhappy. The bookshop contract was signed in November. The new ledger arrived in December, broad-paged and properly bound, and Verity opened it on the counter and wrote both their names on the first page in her careful hand. Verity Farrow and Gideon Farrow. And the accounts ran together from there, one column and one hand and one life, written in the same ink on the same page. On the last evening of the year, Gideon locked the door behind the final customer himself, as he had taken to doing most evenings. The lamp on the counter burned low and then went out. In the morning, 2 cups of tea sat on the counter, and the new ledger lay open to a fresh page, and the first entry of the new year was already written. Both their names at the top, the balance carried forward, the next column waiting.